Thank you, everybody, and welcome to the Future Cities Summit. I need a clicking device to advance the slides from somebody, but I'm going to be talking to you about the biggest possible picture, the trends and forces around the world that are driving change in cities, that are creating challenges and opportunities in cities, and hopefully I'll be able to set the stage for Desmond and Tessie, who will be following me, who are people who are working on the ground in specific locations and who can talk about trends in a much more concrete and driven way. Let me start with the most global and largest scale possible question. We know the world is changing from being a rural place to being an urban place. This is the century during which we became a largely urban planet, and by the end of this century, the entire planet will be as urbanized as North America and Western Europe are. So let's look at the larger picture. This graph looks at the bottom we have a completely rural place, at the top we have a completely urban place. At the left, we have the period just after the Second World War. On the right, we have midway through this century. And where do we stand in urbanization? Here in Western Europe and North America, and as well in Oceania, Australasia, we are about as urban as you can get. Any growth that we've seen in the urbanization of these parts of the world since about the 1960s has not been a consequence of people moving from rural areas to urban areas. It's been a consequence of cities expanding and people's residences being redefined from rural to urban. It's physical growth of cities rather than changes in population that's driven it. But the rest of the world is in the midst of a change that we went through in the period before the Second World War. Latin America has caught up. In Latin American countries are now as urban as anywhere in North America or Western Europe. And you can see that change. The types of conflicts and disputes that happened in Latin American countries in the 60s and 70s and 80s changed their nature as they became places that accepted their urban status. But Asia and Africa are the places where the shift from rural life to urban life is still underway, and where we're seeing the largest urban growth. And that shift varies. I mean, some places like China has passed the 50% mark already. Some countries in Africa, like South Africa and Libya, are very urbanized already. Others are much further down that curve. And you see a shift in life, in sustainability, in economic prospects, and in migratory patterns as you shift into being a more urban place. As populations become urbanized, their longevity increases, their average income increases, absolute poverty ends, and important things like the education rate of women becomes equal. Family sizes drop to below the reproduction rate, so it's very important for ecological sustainability to support urban growth, because that's what reduces the human impact on the climate. And significantly, as cities reach a certain size and income, that's when they shift from being places of rural to urban migration within countries to places that produce international migration. People do not move internationally until they've reached a certain level of income that usually requires an urban life. So as we see here, most of the really major urban growth around the world now, that's the oranges and reds there, is now in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Indian subcontinent, and East Asia. Although there is substantial urban growth in many parts of the world, including in North America going on. But we have to think of where those drivers are. And we shouldn't think of that urban growth in Africa and so on as being some chaotic, Blade Runner mess or something like that. In places like Lagos, in Kinshasa, you see really smart urban infrastructure investments taking place. There's sort of a new revolution in urban leadership and thought taking place in the global south and east right now. But what it means is that during the 20th century, we got used to talking about the big urban problems as problems of the first urban generation, the people who were the new urbanites, who'd moved from subsistence, rural living, and the risk of absolute poverty to the bottom rung of the urban ladder. But increasingly in this century and starting now, the urban problems we face are the problems of what I would call the second urban generation, the people whose parents or grandparents were the first urbanites and who expect certain things from their cities, who expect to be included, who expect to have a better living than their parents had, who expect to be physically connected and connected to the economy and education and political system, and are often finding themselves disappointed by that lack of inclusion. You could say that many cities around the world got very good during the last 40 or 50 years at creating a bottom rung on the urban ladder, a place to make your start. But a lot of them now have troubles creating a second and third rung on that ladder so people can make their way up. So I'd like to start thinking about the people who are not new to the city, but who expect to be full urban citizens at this point and are being frustrated. I would argue that a lot of the tensions in what we call the middle income countries and even in North America and Europe are created by people who are facing that disappointment, who see the roof of the lowest ranks of the middle class above them and no footholds to get there. And these divisions are often along cultural and racial lines. So let me just take a very quick tour of the forces that I think are affecting a very large number of cities around the world right now, some of which you all know about, some of which I hope I can change some of the dialogue around. First of all, as we all know, housing is expensive. It's unaffordable to many people. This is not just true here or across the Western world. This is true almost everywhere in the world right now. There are crises of housing supply pushing up prices. This is Ciudad Neza in Mexico City, by the way, and a lack of dialogue around solutions to that. There's not a shortage of urban space. There are not a lack of economic forces that should be able to allow the creation of housing for people, but there are political and organizational barriers in many countries that make housing a brick wall for that second generation. Second, we see labor markets in cities shifting from what we used to call the Fordist model, where you came to the city and you got a full-time job at a factory or something like that, and you did that job for your life and it supported your family, to an informalized labor market where people are doing a little buying and selling here, working on a short-term contract there, doing a little gig economy stuff there. What some development economists call portfolios of the poor, where you have a portfolio of different income sources and so on. And that changes the geography of cities. It changes the organization of cities because people are now doing economic activity all over the place in many different ways. This is in, that shot is Neukölln in Berlin, by the way. Third, in many places, we see the shift of both immigration and poverty from the urban core to the outskirts and the suburbs, to the lower population density, less transportation provided places. Certainly in cities like Toronto, we see that, where we saw a dramatic shift over the last 40 years where newcomers were settling in the Little Italies and Chinatowns of the center of the city. Now almost all newcomers settle in the inner suburbs. But we see that in a great many European cities as well, a shift of the people who are in lower incomes, either because they're newcomers or because they're subject to intergenerational poverty, to the fringes of the city. And that is partly related to another problem that I would like to draw attention to. We are used to talking about the problems of cities as being problems of crowding and overpopulation of cities and things like that. I'd like to start thinking about the problems of low population density in cities, even in cities that we think of as being dense and crowded. A lot of the problems with housing supply we discussed, a lot of the problems with the peripheralization of immigration and poverty we discussed are due to the fact that there are large zones in major cities of very low population density, usually for reasons of policy and politics and development economics and so on, which make life difficult for people. And I focus on this image on the outskirts of Toronto. This is the signature form of Toronto housing here, the slab farm, with big empty green spaces between it. That's where most immigration happens in Canada, in places like that. And those are places of very low population density. We don't tend to think of them that way. It's hard to create transit. It's hard to create densities that allow markets and small business to thrive and that sort of thing. But even in cities in lower income countries, there are problems with large areas of undeveloped space, and this is a big part of why we have housing crises and so on. We need to have a political will to free up the spaces that are undeveloped, to create tight-knit communities in places that are empty, and in the Zwischenstadt, as sometimes it gets called, the places without places on the edge of the city, between the freeways, where there aren't the materials of urban life, yet people live there in large numbers. Institutions. There'll be a lot of talk over the next couple days about institutions, and many cities face this problem, that there are new urban populations and established urban populations who aren't represented in institutions, who aren't served by institutions. In the global south, there are many cities that do not recognize large parts of their population as being legitimate citizens, who see their informal housing developments as a tumor on the side of the city or something like that, who do not build schools and hospitals. And often people from less than beneficial organizations end up serving as de facto urban governments in those places. Narco-trafficking gangs, Islamist organizations, and so on. But here we see this problem as well, with an inequality of representation in urban life. The racialized people living in the inner suburbs of Western cities find themselves not as represented and included in institutions, in infrastructure, in governance. And that leads to resentments, that leads to political conflicts and crises in many places. And I'd like to talk about a problem that I think is under-recognized and that faces a lot of cities around the world now, which is that the challenges that cities face are increasingly challenges that are matters of national policy, but that manifest themselves almost entirely in urban areas. Yet cities do not have either the resources or the funds to deal with those. Of course, migration tends to be the biggest thing we talk about in that sense. Migration and asylum are national policies in every country, yet they are almost entirely urban phenomena. And the resources often aren't there in cities. But here we have an image of Syrian refugees arriving in Toronto with a bunch of local politicians and national and provincial politicians from not long ago welcoming them. That is a case that we see often, is that cities want people and national governments aren't delivering them. During the European migration crisis of 2015 and 2016, it was cities like Hamburg and Leipzig and Frankfurt that were driving the poll to get people. They were saying, we need a couple 100,000 people each. We have labor shortages. We have places we want to fill. And that created tensions with national governments. But they were also the cities that turned a crisis into something that was less of a crisis. And we see that in many other places too, where the politics of the city are at odds with the politics of the national government, and where the funding and resources aren't there. Cities have become the largest national actors in many countries, but they do not have national authority or the sort of budgets or financial resources that they need. And that's not just in migration, it's in poverty, drug problems, and I would say here in Canada, I should point out, Indigenous affairs is a largely urban matter. Most people of First Nations and Inuit and Métis background in Canada live in cities, yet Indigenous affairs are a matter of national politics or of band council politics, and cities often don't have the resources to be, or a self-recognition as being the centers of Indigenous life that they have become. So let's round that up and look at the larger picture here. How do we deal with these problems? The problems and stresses that I'm talking about are not the problems and stresses of failure or decline. They are the problems and stresses of success and growth. Cities are more successful now than they have been in history. They are growing more. They are able to manage that growth more in almost every part of the world better than they have been able to before. We know how to govern cities. We know how to create infrastructure. We know how to create institutions that can work for people. We have a shared knowledge among leaders of cities around the world in how to do things. But the problems we face are the problems of popularity and growth. You find a housing price crisis almost impossibly difficult, but it is far, far better than having a crisis of housing decline and housing loss. Humans are unique among animals in that we do not have a homeostatic population balance. We do not have a steady state. We are either growing or we're declining. And it's better to have the problems of growth than the problems of decline, as anyone who's gone through the latter can testify. But we need to spend the next couple of days talking about this. How do we make sure that the second and third generations of urbanites in the Southern Hemisphere, in the Eastern Hemisphere, and here in the West feel like they have the same opportunities, the same chance of a good urban life as their parents and grandparents did? How do we make sure that the rest of this century, is a time where those people are building sustainability, where they're building better lives for themselves, where they're improving the prospects for themselves and entering a more equal and sustainable world, using the tools of the cities around us? And I expect to be learning from you all over the next couple days about what the best methods are for facing those challenges, so we can then move from the general to the specific, from the problems into the solutions. Thank you very much.